It is my strongly held view that in the context of Ukraine, to seek a premature peace, despite many of its short-term attractions, will not be in the longer-term interests of an enduring peace in Europe. Well, it's a pleasure to be invited along tonight, but to participate in this very important and very timely debate. I congratulate Madam President and the wider Union for scheduling it. I'm delighted that you thought to invite a senior military officer along to contribute. By and large, senior military officers keep their views to themselves, but I was happy to make this debate an exception. I will admit, though, it's quite an intimidating prospect, especially following a world champion. It is far more exhilarating than the relatively sleepy benches of the House of Lords on a Thursday evening. A few of you might know that I'm the only Chief of Defence. I think I'm the only four-star officer in Defence who can boast a son who's a professional comedian. But I'm not here to entertain you or to stun you with great oratory. My ambition is far more modest. My journey to Oxford will have been worth it if all I do is make the point that, despite the remarkable advances in the human condition that we've enjoyed over the last 100 or so years, I do fear that our world remains a most imperfect place. It's been said, we in Britain live in a society that is remarkably civilized. We don't always appreciate it. But humanity retains the potential for brutality and evil, and sometimes it has to be confronted. Sometimes the use of force and the sacrifice that war necessitates is the only course of action. And I say this because it is my strongly held view that in the context of Ukraine, to seek a premature peace, despite many of its short-term attractions, will not be in the longer-term interests of an enduring peace in Europe. What I just want to do, very briefly, is to summarize the war so far, to indicate how the character of that war has changed, and in so doing, trying to convince you that a lasting peace cannot yet be achieved and should therefore not yet be sought. And I also want to indicate why I believe a victory for both Ukraine and the West has now become even more vital. You know, the war in Ukraine is the biggest interstate conflict in Europe since the end of the Second World War. European nations have not really crossed the watershed of formalized conflict at scale for over 75 years. And indeed, I don't think that President Putin would have launched his illegal invasion even now if we in the West had been more vigilant in our primary defense duty of deterring conflict. Putin launched his invasion, many of you know this now, because he made a strategic calculation that he could win a short war. He based that calculation on three assumptions: the assessed high quality of his own forces, the relative poor quality of Ukrainian forces, and his firm belief that NATO lacked the resilience and the integrity to do anything meaningful in response. I think you could correctly speculate that had Putin's assumptions been correct, and he'd won a short and limited war, then the West might well have stood by, watched, criticized, but subsequently accepted a humiliation of Ukraine. And in many ways, let's face it, such an outcome might even have been easier. But the fact is, all Putin's assumptions were wrong. And what has happened over the last 2 years is that Russia has, so far, militarily failed. Ukraine has demonstrated remarkable human fortitude, and NATO, thus far, has shown a relative strong resolve to face down Russian aggression. But I think we now stand at a tipping point. I think we are in a decisive year. Why do I say this? The character of this war has now changed. There is now far more clearly a war of two distinct sorts. One, if you like, is a tactical conflict, the other a strategic confrontation. The tactical conflict is the one within Ukraine, which, despite the scale of its brutality and tragedy, is still a limited war, limited both by geography and the means employed. And I don't think that this will be the decisive battle. Separately, however, there is a much more strategic confrontation. It's one that now does extend into the domestic space, maybe of the free world, but certainly in Europe. It's a war that is all about credibility, morality, and the norms of international conduct. It's a war primarily of willpower, resolve, and resources, and it's a war we now have to win. Initial failure, I think, has forced Putin to reimagine his own theory of victory. He now knows it doesn't lay in a short, decisive conflict. He believes it now lay in a battle of will, both to subjugate Ukraine, but also to fragment the resolve of NATO and the West. He thinks he can win such a war. The playground bully has become the aspirant imperialist. He sees opportunities in the unknown outcomes of American politics and policy. He sees the potential for weakness in the resolve of some European countries. He would, I fear, dearly like to see both Ukraine and Western countries seek the pragmatism of peace, a peace which he can present to his own people as victory. After all, he enjoys a virtual monopoly of truth over them. Putin must not be allowed to bring about an end to this conflict on his terms. He cannot be allowed to present to the world the delusion of a victory. We must not permit him the comfort of a period of respite that he would undoubtedly use to regenerate his military capability and then probe again in the future. What should we do? If we are not going to encourage peace, our duty is to do the right thing, and therefore I believe we should double down. We should be ever more confident in supplying Ukraine with the military resources it needs to maintain the initiative against Russia. We should not run scared of Putin's threats of escalation, which his supporters won't risk and to which China have declared their aversion. We should reinvigorate the deterrent posture of NATO across Europe, such that the alliance is visibly strengthened and enhanced, and the accession of Finland and Sweden will help enormously in this.
The motion is not what we should do as the West or as NATO. The motion is what do we believe Ukraine should do. We have to assume that the West will continue to operate as we have done, and we can't construct counterfactuals whereby the West suddenly changes all its decisions about whether to allocate aid to Ukraine. We have to consider the world as it is and consider what we would do if we were Ukraine. We cannot start speculating about possible aid and NATO treaties that have not probably been occurred.
And I don't think I'm hypothetically speculating. I'm purely outlining the fact that there is a synergy between Ukraine's success and the ability of NATO, Europe, and the West to support them properly. But it comes with a duty, and the duty is that of doubling down, not failing them. And that's why we should reinvigorate NATO. We should double down on the economic leverage of all Russian foreign assets, which have now been frozen, but should now be put to the use and the purpose of rebuilding Ukraine. We should communicate with absolute clarity our determination to erode the will and resources of Russia. This war has gone beyond the point where we can permit Putin to prevail. We have already invested too much of our credibility in stating our unfailing support to Ukraine. To ask Ukraine to seek a peace they don't yet want would be to compromise on the very principles which we claim to stand for. There are times when strength remains the only answer to evil, and this is one such time. However well-intended, I oppose this motion. It will definitely not serve our longer-term good. And finally, as someone mentioned, I would add, the way you vote tonight sends a message. It sends a message to Putin, and it sends a message to the people of Ukraine. Please do not send the wrong one.